but anytime that the speakers are presenting, that will be shared. So just to let you all know that's the case. All right. So we've been working with the neighboring Hopland band of Pomo Indians on recognizing and acknowledging their strong and long historical role on managing these lands. And so we're in the process of developing our land acknowledgement, and I wanted to share with you where it stands today. We at the Hopland Research and Extension Center exclusively acknowledge with honor the Shoqowa and Hopland people on whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands we work, educate, and learn, and whose historical and spiritual relationship with these lands continues to this day and beyond. So let me just there's a few more folks I'm seeing coming into the waiting room now. Okay. The UC Hopland Research and Extension Center is run by the University of California under the Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. You might have heard of them through programs like 4-H or the California Naturalist Program or Master Gardeners or your Cooperative Extension Office. And they also have 9 fabulous research and extension centers across the state. They're kind of living laboratories that reflect different kinds of agriculture that you might find practiced in California. So we here at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, we have a rangeland system here. We have sheep on the site, and our mission statement is to maintain and enhance ecosystem integrity through applied research, adaptive management, and educational activities. And so today you see 2 of those things going hand in hand, some of the research and the connection to the education that goes alongside that research. So finally, before we move over to our speaker today, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. During our webinars, our Spotlight on Research series, there's a lot that we all want to share, but we do ask a few ground rules before we get started. I'm going to try and make sure that we honor time commitments today so that we respect everybody's time. If we do find that the questions keep us going a little bit longer at the end, then I'll offer, if any of you guys want to leave bang on 12, of course, feel free to do that. But we might have 10 minutes at the very end if you have extra questions. Do share in the success of the webinar, listening actively, and using inquiry to learn more whenever we have the opportunity for questions. We're going to focus on issues, not people or personalities. And if you have something you'd like to say, please do say it, and say it once. And one person will be speaking at a time. All right, I am going to hand over. We're going to start today's webinar with Sarah Caso, who is an undergraduate researcher with UC Berkeley in the Environmental Sciences Policy and Management department, and also works with the Urban Bee Lab, which is housed at UC Berkeley there. Sarah, welcome today. We're thrilled to have you here. And I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to you. Just bear with me a minute to do that. There we go. It's all yours.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, good. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to start off by talking about the diversity of bees. So there are a lot of species of bees, right? So in California alone, there are about 1,700 different species. In the United States, there's 4,000. Around the world, there's 20,000. So there's a large diversity of bees. And so bees range a lot in size and color. So here are just some of the examples of California native bees. So we have green sweat bees, we have mason bees, we have valid carpenter bees. So they range from green. Mason bees are actually a nice iridescent blue. It's really hard to see in this picture. Some more native bees. We have cuckoo bees, which are like cuckoo birds. So they are parasitic. We have small carpenter bees, which are very different from the large carpenter bees here. We have summer longhorn bees, Here's some more bees. So there's a large diversity of bees, and they come out at different times throughout the year. So we have early spring bees, later spring, summer bees. That's just an idea of all the diversity of bees that we have here in California. And so before I get more into bees, I'm going to go over some common misperceptions that people tend to have about bees. Bees live in hives. Really, the only bees that live in hives are honeybees and bumblebees. Most bees are solitary species, so they do not live together in groups. Two, bees, since they don't really have hives, they don't sleep in their hives. A lot of male bees will sleep here. They'll sleep on flowers or on stems all around. Three, bees, only honeybees die after stinging, and only female bees can sting. So that's just some information for you. And then bees don't live that long. Most bees live approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Males live 6 to 8 weeks. Female bees live around 8 weeks long. So they live a very short period of time, depending on what season that they're in. So you have bees that come out early and late. And then male bees don't pollinate. Male bees do pollinate. They just aren't as good pollinators as female bees are, because they're not going around and collecting from flowers to feed their young as female bees do. And then 6, bees make honey. That's only honeybees. Only honeybees make honey. Bumblebees make a really small amount of honey. That's just for their own hive, because bumblebees are social bees. So those are just misperceptions that people tend to have about bees. Before I go into, we'll talk a bit about the importance of bees. So bees are pollinators. We all know this, but they're incredibly important pollinators. So about 75% of flowering plants rely on pollinators, and the majority of which are bees. And so within agriculture, over 100 of the main crops are pollinated by bees. So not only just nature relies on bees, but also our agricultural food systems rely on bees too. So bees are essential for keeping ecosystems biodiverse due to pollination, and also keeping plant life balanced. And over here, this is a really cute squash bee. So agricultural importance. I just touched on this a little bit, but approximately 1/3 of the food that we eat is pollinated by bees, depending on diet, if you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, depending on what you're eating. So just so you get an idea of how many crops this is, here are some examples. We have apples, cherries, peaches, strawberries, squash, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower. Also have nuts like almonds and cashews and coffee. A lot of herbs and spices like coriander, basil, and then also a lot of livestock forage is dependent on bee pollination as well. So we have buckwheat, clover, alfalfa, and then other crops that we don't eat but are important are cotton and linen. So bees play a huge role in agriculture. And so going into what we do, so pollinator populations have been declining. This is due to a multitude of factors. There's a lot going on within the world of pollinators. So there's different things like climate change has been playing into pollinator population decline, things like habitat loss, like urban development, stuff like that. And also pesticide usage, other things like using mulch, which then bees that live underground can't build their nests. So there's a lot of reasons why populations are declining. And so something that we do is we work on tracking, monitoring bees, bee diversity, so we can keep track of, where bees are located, what species are there, what are they, what species of flowers do they like, are they pollinating, all sorts of that stuff. So then we take that information, we propagate plants that we know that bees like. We partner with different areas. So this is an avocado farm in Ventura, and we go in and we help them with creating pollinator environments so that they can help boost their population of native bees. And of course, we also collect bees and they go to our Museum of Entomology for future reference so that we have an understanding in the future of populations of bees over time. And so now let me speak a bit about gardening for bees. Let's see. Okay, the first step is to provide a diverse food sources. So bees, just like all pollinators, they need food sources year round, right? So bees, different species come out at different times, and so they're bees year round, mostly in the spring and the summer, but also some in fall. So in order to sustain populations of bees, you're going to need different sources of pollen and nectar throughout the year. So, right, bees rely on pollen for protein and nectar for carbohydrates. And so then female bees will combine these two and a little loaf for their larvae to feed on. And so, as I mentioned, it's really important that you have plants that bloom at different times throughout the year, so there's always a food source. So just some more information on that. This is a chart because that tracks bee populations, right? So there's going to be the most bees throughout April, May, and June. So this is when you want to have a large percentage of pollen and nectar plants. And then other times throughout the year, you of course still want that. It just varies in the amount of plants that you're going to want that are pollen or nectar, or that are both pollen and nectar. So then some examples of some plants that are great for bees. So these are some early flowering plants that are great for bees that come out early in the season, like some bumblebees that come out really early. So there's the California lilac, we have manzanita, wisteria, and pride of Madeira. So these are some great early spring flowering plants. Some plants that flower later in the year, we have buckwheat, gumplant, and phacelia. These are great for summer bees that come out. Some examples of just nectar providing plants that bees really like: lavender, catnip, and brandegee sage. Actually, a lot of species of sage are great for bees. And then some examples of just pollen plants are California poppies. Bees really love the California poppies, especially bumblebees and green sweat bees. They love this flower. We also have common yarrow. The next step is to make sure that you are providing water for the pollinators, right? So bees, just like, birds, other pollinators, butterflies, they're going to need a water source. So it's great to include like a small pool of water or maybe just a bird bath, but make sure to have stones or some sort of vegetation in that pool of water so that pollinators can land on it, so that bees, have somewhere to land and drink the water so that they don't fall in and drown. So that's really important. Okay, and then it's also important to provide shelter for the bees. So as I mentioned before with mulch, when there's mulch on the ground, it is really hard for species of bees that nest underground. So there's approximately 70% of the native bees in California nest underground. And so they need some uncovered soil or sand in order to nest. So it's really important to leave some space for those bees. Another thing you can do is build what's called a bee hotel. This is a more intensive process. It's not something that you can just it's not like just leaving some soil. This is something that you will need to maintain. So you can do bee blocks. So you drill some holes in blocks of wood for bees that like to nest in wood, or you can include some dried, hollowed out stems for bees that like to nest in there. It's also important to keep your bee hotel out of direct sunlight and also direct shade. So you need to put it maybe under in an area that's going to get some sunlight, but it's also not directly in the sun. So it's partially shaded, because it's also important that it doesn't get rained on so that it doesn't get moldy. So bee hotels are a little bit of an intensive process, right? You're going to need to make sure that there's no mold in there, and that it's not infested with species of insects that are going to prey on bees. It's a much higher intensive process in gardening. These are some other tips. If you want a large diversity of bees and you want a lot of bees, it's helpful to plant larger patches of flowers. So bees will prefer to visit plots of flowers that are at least 1 meter in diameter. So if you have a good large amount of that flower. Also, you want to ideally plant 10 to 20 different species of plants, which isn't always possible. Also, I apologize for the text on the screen. I'm sorry about that. But if that's not possible, you want to plant at least 10 different bee species, bee plant species in your garden, and make sure that they're blooming at different times so that bees have a diversity of food. And of course, you want to avoid using pesticides that will kill bees, but also other helpful pollinator insects that will come in, like wasps, who are also important insects. And you also want to avoid mulch, as I mentioned, so that bees can nest underground. So this is an example of a 30 feet by 30 feet garden, which is 900 square feet. So it's not a little tiny garden. This is just an example of, so here we have a large diversity of plant species. We have a bird bath, and of course, we're making sure to leave empty space so that bees can nest. And so I'll just give a little bit of a brief on hedgerows before John comes in and talks more about hedgerows and pollinators and that project. But you don't need a massive garden to help pollinators, right? So even if you only have like a small garden space, that is helpful. Bees will love it. But you can also, hedgerows are also great for all sorts of pollinators and insects. So just, lines of some dense shrubbing, pollinator plants, surrounding large areas on the side of roads, all sorts of that stuff, as long as they include pollen and nectar sources. And they're going to be great. They're a habitat for all different pollinators. They provide, housing, they provide food, and they will attract pollinators. Okay, so then if you're looking for more resources, we have an extensive list of pollinator plants on our website, and it goes through which bees like it, all sorts of that stuff if you're looking for more of that information. And then thank you for listening. This is now a good time for some questions.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and the work of the Urban Bee Lab with us. I have popped into the chat the link to the Urban Bee Lab website. And after the webinar today, I will put together links that I'm seeing shared in the chat and send those around by email to everybody. So if you don't manage to copy down the chat, don't worry, I'll be able to share that with you guys. Sarah, I see some questions coming up in the chat already. There is something I forgot to do as we launch the webinar, so I hope it's going to be all right with folks. Before we get into the questions, I have a very quick poll to just put out there to get a sense of where we're all at as far as thinking about gardening for pollinators and hedgerows. So I'm just going to launch that poll, and if folks would be willing to just answer these questions, that would be wonderful. I'll just give you a quick second or two to do that. And then, Sarah, while we're waiting for those to come in, while folks are just taking a quick look and adding their responses here, I'm going to get started with some of the questions. First one from our local resource conservation districts. They were really happy with your slides today, and they were wondering if you might be willing to share those slides.
Yes, yeah, I can download them as a PDF and send them to you. You can
Great, and we can share that out with the email. Thank you for that. We appreciate it. And then, so then we wanted to check in about the proximity of water to pollinators. Somebody was pointing out they were guessing that probably natural water sources were close enough, but do you actually need to be providing water closer, and how close do you need it to your pollinator plants?
Yeah, so bees ideally don't like to travel more than like 50 to 500 meters away from an area. So if you don't have a water source that's like nearby, it is very helpful to have one with you. Also, some bee species use like water to create like mud for their own habitats, so like for their nests. So it is helpful to like have, if you don't live nearby like a river or stream, something like that, it is important to have a water source because bees do not like to travel very far distances.
Got it. I guess it uses up energy that could be used helpfully elsewhere, right?
Yes.
Okay, we also had a question regarding mulch. I think this is a really interesting one because folks are also really considering about how they have drought-tolerant gardens, how they preserve and conserve water in the garden. So do you have any tips on balancing water conservation and pollinator planting?
Yes, that's a great question. I guess it's just, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, like our best species for that, like our best plant species, what is, you know, drought tolerant and also bees like. I recommend checking out our list that has like a whole bunch of different species, and then you can look and choose which ones, okay, these ones are more drought tolerant, like, because we have a whole bunch of native plant species on there. So maybe look for more of the chaparral native plants that you won't need to, you know, water a lot, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is when you're planning a garden, is it possible to mulch certain areas, but know that you have an area where you've left the soil open for ground nesting bees? Do they need like a large area, or could you organize one part of the garden where you think, okay, great, I'm letting them have this for their home?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to completely not use mulch in your entire garden, as long as you leave, you know, maybe like you can leave like small areas and a few different places, so that there's some different sources where bees can nest, because not all the bees are going to want to live next to each other because they are different species. So you don't need to have like the entire garden. Just make sure that maybe there's a few patches where you leave no mulch so that the bees do have that area.
Excellent, thank you. So then we have a question. Can you briefly update regarding the neonicotinoid problem and pesticide issue and ways to ensure that the nursery or source plants aren't using them? Anything you might be able to add on that, Sarah?
I am not an expert in pesticide usage.
That's fine.
So I speak outside my
no worries. I do notice that we have a couple of representatives from the California Native Plant Society, the local Sanhedrin chapter. Brooke actually posed that question. Brooke, I wonder if you'd want to unmute and maybe share anything that you have to offer on that.
Yeah, hi. I am also not an expert on that issue, Sarah. So I just know that I've heard things, I've seen headlines. I know that certain nurseries use those sorts of pesticides. I know they're detrimental to all bee populations. And I just don't know the extent to which the EPA might be addressing that issue, or anyways, if there's anybody on the line that has an update on that. I really haven't kept track. I just know that I'm trying to grow things from seed and use responsible nurseries that don't use those kinds of pesticides. So
feel free if anybody on the line has extra information on that topic. I know we have some great folks who have this kind of knowledge in the call. No pressure. And also, Sarah, I'm guessing that the Urban Bee Lab themselves may have some information or advice about that. So maybe that's something we could follow up with the lab and just see what else we can have to offer to add into that post-event email. So let's move on. Let's have a quick look around what else we have in the chat here. So we have somebody's commented here, we have free ranging chickens. Will they be detrimental to ground nesting bees?
That's an interesting question. I don't know about that. Some bee species, like the mining bees, they have like extensive underground nests. So I assume some chickens going around won't interfere with like their underground environment. Yeah.
Sounds
Sorry,
like
I don't know more. No,
that's fine, Sarah. That's great. Thank you for the answer. Seems like that's an interesting research area for all these folks with backyard chickens these days. I also noticed Peggy Backup commented, and Peggy has a great deal of knowledge about planting. She's commented that you can mulch around plants and then you can leave the unmulched areas, just as you were pointing out, Sarah. So let's see. I have a comment here that somebody's noticed that there are almost no bumblebees this spring. They're usually abundant at this time of year during the madrone bloom. And is this widespread this year? Sarah, do you have anything to add on what we're seeing this year that might be different?
I don't. I went out earlier this spring and March monitoring bees, and we saw some bumblebees. I've seen some. I don't have a good idea of populations from year to year. I have only been in Northern California. So I don't know how widespread it is that maybe bumblebees aren't coming out as much this year. It also has to do with rain, what's blooming right now, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So it's possible
if this is just maybe in the area that you're living in, or if it's country.
Is it likely that the drought would have impact though? I mean, it seems like it's like very likely to be having some impact on our bee species.
Yes. So if we don't have, that's something that we keep track of when we're monitoring populations in terms of like weather, how rainy it's been. So that impacts what's blooming, how much has been blooming, which then in terms how many bees are coming out, which bees are coming out.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I see it's always interesting to see in the chat, I see some folks who are pointing out they've seen lots of bees on their fruit trees. So I think you probably see that a lot, Sarah, when you're out monitoring bee populations. Is there a great deal of difference just in small local areas even?
Yeah, even within just like I mean, even dependent on like what specific flower you're looking at, right? Because some bees are more specialized to certain flowers. They like some more than others. They're gonna see some flowers with a lot of, like I hear in Berkeley, Pride of Madeira, and I see so many bumblebees. They're everywhere. And then I also have lavender out front, and I just see there's usually just a lot of honeybees, right? So it depends on also what you're looking at, what species of bees you're gonna see.
Yeah, I've really noticed here that there's having been here a few years now, a time of year when when you're near a madrone tree, if you closed your eyes, you could still tell just because of the hum that comes off it of all the bees, when maybe that's a really important food source for them. Okay, so we are going to start moving across to conversation with the director here at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, John Bailey. Sarah, if you wouldn't mind just shutting, that's great. Thank you so much. Just as we're preparing for that, I did want to mention a couple of things that are coming up at the Hopland Research and Extension Center. We are busy as bees at the moment, planning for lots of events. We have self-guided hikes that you are welcome to come up on Saturdays here. You do have to arrive between 9 and 10 a.m. and I can get you checked in during that time and safely set off on a specific hiking route that we have all prepared for you in advance. And we do encourage registration in advance, just so I know how many folks are coming out. But if you can't manage to do that, then as I say, coming in between 9 and 10 on a Saturday morning, we can get you set out on a self-guided hike. Registration really helps because occasionally we have the guardian dogs and the sheep out and about, and I do have to cancel on some weekends. So that helps to make sure that I can keep you up to date. We also have family pod field trips right now. So those are an opportunity to come and bio-blitz with us. You can come and try and find with your family group, that's up to 10 people, or your social group. You can come and try and find as many different species as possible. And we'll definitely be looking out for bees. And we'll be putting up our observations using this free web-based app, iNaturalist. So it's a great tool that I can teach everybody who comes out for that how to use, and we'll take a look and try and find some reptiles as well, birds, plants, mammals. We'll be trying to find all of them. And then just a couple of other things. We also have our NorCal Climate Futures event. So that's a series of webinars focusing on climate resiliency in the northern part of California. So we have those, you'll find, I'll put a link in the chat. You can sign up for any of those as they come up over the next few months. And then last but not least, we just have got the go-ahead to run our kids summer camp here. So we will be running 2 weeks of summer camp. There are separate sessions, so kids would sign up for 1 week. And we'll be focusing on sustainability. So looking right across our resources and how we can be living a more sustainable life and how our kids can help us do that. So at that point, I am going to just double check. I see John Bailey is just joining our webinar right now. He's just been on a political discussion about environmental issues in the North Coast, and he's just joining. So he's going to launch straight into this webinar, focusing on hedgerows and the use of hedgerows for many different things. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry that I'm joining late and that I missed your presentation, Sarah. Just got off a different meeting.
Yeah, so great to have you here, John. I've mentioned you are the director of the Hopland Research and Extension Center. And if it's okay with you, we're going to turn to you now and learn a little bit about hedgerows and the great grant that you guys got.
Okay, great. Well, I will share my screen. Can you just confirm that you're seeing it? Okay, great. Oh, and I see that the little title that I had from the last webinar is still on here, which is funny. Okay, anyway, so before I get into this, the project and talking about hedgerows, the funding for the hedgerow that I'm going to talk about comes from the California Climate Investment Program. And it's really part of the cap and trade program, which is funding this. So huge thanks to the California Department of Food and Agriculture for their Healthy Soils program, And they do have grants out there for people who do want to install hedgerows like this and do other climate smart practices. So just briefly, and I don't know whether this got covered earlier, I'm speaking to you from the UC Hopland Research and Extension Center, and our mission is to maintain and enhance ecosystem integrity through applied research, adaptive management, and educational activities, while also supporting working landscapes with diverse agricultural products and recognized ecosystem services derived from these landscapes. Hedgerows tie into all of those. The one that we're going to be looking at here and talking about is hedgerow on rangeland, but hedgerows can go on all different types of working landscapes, and you'll see there are all types of different benefits, both agricultural products and ecosystem services. So this kind of lists off the diversity of hedgerow benefits. Sarah was talking specifically about pollinators, but there's a range of biodiversity impacts of hedgerows. They can provide habitat and food sources for birds, insects, all types of wildlife. They can help be a physical barrier on your property, blocking wind, providing shelter for your animals from the sun, keeping dust down from roads, slowing the flow of water across your landscape to reduce erosion, blocking pesticides, and also providing a visual barrier from neighboring activities. One of the reasons that the Healthy Soils program exists is to really help with our efforts to reduce climate change effects by sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And hedgerows can help do this because of the growth of their plants is not just above ground, but below ground. So they're continually taking carbon from the atmosphere and moving it down into the root zone and into the soils. There's also economic benefits. You can design your hedgerows to provide cutting materials for propagating other plants. If you have a nursery operation, there's all types of different plants you can incorporate into your hedgerows that provide products that you can sell, and they can also beautify your farming operation. There's a lot of different types of hedgerows. You can do a really nicely groomed one. You can put in ornamental species. You can choose floral species that have staggered blooming times. So with a little bit of thought, you can increase the aesthetic beauty while also promoting good ecological function. You can do a more wild type of design where you're not maintaining it as much, but it can still provide a lot of those benefits of increased habitat, soil carbon sequestration, and then providing functionality on your farm by making a physical barrier. So when you really get into designing a hedgerow, you've got to really figure out what you're trying to achieve. And there's some of those benefits that I mentioned. So you really want to look at what are you trying to target of those benefits in habitat, in physical barrier, what kind of money do you want to make off it or do you need to make off of it, and choose your plants around those benefits. There's a lot of really great resources out there to help you decide what type of plants to incorporate for what type of benefits. And then the resource constraints. I mean, everybody has different types of climates. Here in California, there's all types of microclimates, and especially choosing your plants, you have to be really careful about frost. There's a lot of great plants for hedgerows that don't do well with frost in our areas. And they also might come from a more arid area where they're not going to adapt well to our usual rainfall of 30+ inches. But there's other things. I mean, it takes some expertise to put them in. It takes time and it takes money. So you've got to weigh those when you're deciding how big your hedgerow is going to be, where you're going to put it, what you're going to incorporate, and how much you're going to invest. There are steps to go through. What we were just talking about was determining the goals and constraints. Then you've got to figure out where you want to put it, what the slope is, what the climate is of that area. And then you can move into a planting plan where you start to really decide what are the exact plants that you want to incorporate. How exactly are you going to orient it? And then a really important one in terms of the viability of maintaining your hedgerow in an economical manner is how are you going to manage weeds and pests? Those can be mammalian pests like grazing animals or gophers. They can be pernicious weeds that grow up and surround and cover your hedgerow plants. So you need to have a plan for that. Then you have to find your materials, and it's really good to have backup plants. That's one thing I found, especially if you're trying to target natives, especially in these COVID times where people have been doing a lot of gardening that has not occurred in the past. There can be backlogs, back orders, and lack of supply. So you might have to pivot. Then you've got to prepare the ground, and you can just mow it, which is the least invasive and gives you a clear patch to plant into. Other times, if you've got larger shrubs that you've got to remove, you've got perennial weeds, you might want to go into disking or even tilling the ground. Those do require more energy input. They are more destructive to the soil, but in certain circumstances, it's worth that temporary disturbance to set the land up well for future easy operation of your hedgerow. And then you've got to decide if you're going to fence. Because if you have heavy deer pressure or grazing animals, you might need to put either a fence around the whole thing or specific areas. And then planting, I'll go into that in more detail, but you really want to make sure your plants are not below grade. They should be slightly above, because especially with natives, if they get a moist crown and water happens to go into a depression around it, that's when you can get your plants dying off. Mulch is one of those very important weed control strategies. I'll show you some examples of these different types of sheet mulch, compost, and chips. And then in our area, irrigation, while not totally necessary if you are doing all natives that are adapted to our area and you plant in the fall, so they have the winter rains to establish, irrigation for at least the first 2 or 3 years is really going to help you get that hedgerow established and growing well. And you've got to figure out how to do that with the, how much water it's going to need, how much irrigation water you have. And drip, again, is going to help conserve the water and control weeds. I mentioned in the pest control around the weeds, gophers can also be a problem, and we're having a problem with them here. So having a management plan for those pests is important. And then you've got a plan for the long run. Some plants are going to die, and then some have to be pruned and managed. So one of the first things to do is start with a good planting plan. And this is an example of what we did here for our hedgerow. And I used Excel because you can set it out and actually make it work in space. So like on this map, I made 1 square equal 4 feet. And so then as you're designing your hedgerow, you can really make sure that you're incorporating enough room for each plant, but not too much room. It's really tempting to plant your, they might be a tiny little 1-gallon plant and you want to put them every 2 feet apart. But if they're going to be a 15-foot wide shrub, you're overplanting. So going through the planting plans helps you think it out. And in this one, because we're doing a demonstration, I really went with a diverse design and then tried to create zones. So there's some zones that are more chaparral species. There's some that are more riparian species. There's some that are economic crops like the elderberry in the front here. And then this big circle in the middle is an oak tree. And you don't want to irrigate under your oak trees. So if you're going to put plants under your oak drip line, then make sure that they're really drought tolerant ones, so you're doing a minimum of irrigation. And I can't stress enough, the planting plan is really important. It helps you design your irrigation and weed control, and then it really helps when you come to actually plant the design out. When I was doing it, I kind of came up with a chart and went down and decided which plants we were going to put in. This really helped me figure out the water needs, so I could group them on the right irrigation line to not overwater or underwater. Also to look at what the spacing would be so that it's laid out correctly and each plant has enough but not too much room to grow. And then also then you can do a budget off of that, because they vary dramatically in price, whether you're doing a 4-inch pot or a 1-gallon. You could put in 5 gallons. They're a lot more expensive and they're also really hard to find. So mostly you're going to probably be buying 1-gallon plants or 4-inch pots. locally here, Cal Flora Nursery in Santa Rosa is a really good source for natives. And then Mendocino College, which is currently doing their annual plant sale online. So if you search for that, you can find them. They source a lot of natives locally. So if you really want to get that local adaptation, Mendocino College and Jim Zeroyans there is a great source. So I'll go kind of into what we did. So a lot of rangelands that have been grazed for a lot of time, they don't have a lot of shrub species. You know, here, this is a shot of our area. You've got the overstory of the oaks, you've got the grassland, but not a lot in between. So what we're doing is we came through, and you might have to use a shovel, most people will. We do have a skid steer with an auger on it, so that really helped us. But making a hole that's twice the diameter of the plant you're putting in so that it has room for the roots to expand is an important part. And then putting your plants in a line makes it a lot easier to do weed control, whether you're mowing or weed eating, and then also for getting a mulch strip down, and then also for irrigation lines to just be straight and you know where the pipes are. So then we moved into planting, and as you can see, you know, we're in grouping them by size. So you've got larger plants like mountain mahogany, poyon, and coffeeberry in the back row, spaced wider apart, and in the front is goldenrod, so you want them grouped closer together. So we came through and we planted first. Then we went through and we laid down sheet mulch of cardboard, which you can see sticking through the mulch here, the compost mulch. And that sheet mulch just provides a blanket barrier that blocks weeds for the first couple of years. The compost on top of it helps that degrade, biodegrade into the soil. And then the compost also will provide some nutrition for the plants in the long run. You don't want to put heavy fertilizer on a lot of the natives. They're just not adapted to it, and you can burn them out. And like I was mentioning, you know, not all of these plants on the left-hand side are dead. Some of them are just dormant for the winter time, but you do have to plan for replacement. And this was taken in the winter when a lot of them were dormant and they were just being put in. Then we went back through after the sheet mulch and the compost and put on our irrigation lines. You can see these black poly lines here. And we went with a irrigation timer. There on this post, we have our irrigation timer, and then it's a solar operated one. So you don't have to have power. They've come out with a lot of good solar operated valves, but having that timer and having electric valves that are operated by the timer is a great way to make sure that your plants get watered. You're not going to have to remember to go out there. And putting a filter on your irrigation setup is also important, so you don't end up with plugged emitters. And then what we did is drip emitters to each plant, but not right on the crown of the plant. Make sure you're putting it off to the side. Just a few inches off to the side will help, so you're not having that crown rot and death of your plants due to the water being on the crown. Oh, one last thing. We did put in a fence because the pasture to the right of here is grazed by sheep regularly. And we will probably take part of the fence down later on once the plants are established. So the cost is a highly variable, and it depends on how big your plants are, how rough your land is, what you're paying for labor, how much the site prep costs you in, you know, removing vegetation that's there or leveling the ground. $2 to $10 per linear foot is kind of a broad range for California. So for a 500-foot hedgerow, you're looking at $1,000 to $5,000. And then things that cost money include the plants and the irrigation. And you know, it also takes a little bit of expertise and time. If you have a grazing operation, you will lose a little bit of grazing ground. So you have to make that calculation yourself, whether the benefits that we listed earlier make up for that lost grazing ground. You can be designing in pest habitat. So again, there's a lot of guides, and I'll show you some of them a little bit later on, that can help you try to minimize that pest habitat function. Fencing, like I just mentioned, there's a little bit of extra cost there. And then especially for the, you know, planting them right and then maintaining them in the long run, some horticultural knowledge is important. knowing when to prune right, how much water you're going to put on. So that's, again, there's really good guides out there that can help you gain some basic horticultural knowledge if you don't already have it. And because you do have to plan on some maintenance in the long run. Doing a good design, like I mentioned, with the good weed control, the irrigation system, choosing plants well can help minimize the maintenance, but there will be some that you need to do. So I mentioned some of these guides. You know, one of the standard kind of Bible for hedgerows is this Hedgerows and Farmscaping for California Agriculture. It's written by Sam Earnshaw and Joanne Baumgartner, and it's just got great species lists, planting plans, troubleshooting, ways to design around what you're wanting to achieve with your hedgerow. So I'd really recommend this, and there's a link. And I believe we are recording this so that if you go to the recording that Hannah will share, you can link to this. Also, Chico State has a great website, their regenerative agriculture website, and they have pulled together a list of all kinds of different resource materials out there. You can see here, I just did a screenshot of some of them. It's cut off, but the list extends beyond. And then down at the bottom, they have a great resources section for finding funding, because there are a lot of government programs that will provide cost share to you to establish a hedgerow. So see, these are some of those. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has a few different programs. Their Environmental Quality Incentives Program, their Conservation Resource Program. I might have gotten that one wrong. There's too many acronyms. And then the resource conservation districts, we have one here in Mendocino County. I see Megan, the director, is on this. They can also help direct you towards resources and help you find funding opportunities. The Farm Service Agency, another federal government program, also can provide you with knowledge of how to find funding. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, and what's funding our program here is this incentives program from the CDFA. And then again, Chico State has pulled together a lot of direct links on their website for other funding sources that you can seek. So I would recommend that you go visit that website if you're really interested in this. So that's basically the end of my presentation. Just wanted to say thanks again to the California Climate Investments for the funding for this. And then I'd like to open it up for questions. Anything that I've mentioned here, please feel free to ask a question on, and I can go back to different slides if you want.
Thank you so much, John. That was great. It's so exciting to see that project happening. We are at 11:56. Now we are going to, for those who want to stick around, we are going to add on an extra 10 minutes so we can have a bit more time for questions with John. But for those who have to leave at 12, there are two things I do need to ask before you go. One is we have another quick poll that I would just love to have folks finish the webinar with. There are questions about what you learned today, and then there are a few questions just about demographics to make sure that we're sharing our program equally. So if you wouldn't mind just spending a minute answering those questions. And while you are looking at those, I'm also just going to do a quick plug for our fabulous new Hopland Research and Extension Center t-shirts, obscured by my mask, but you can see the beautiful oak on the t-shirt, our mountain lion. These are all pictures taken from our trail cameras. So these are now available to buy from Hopland REC, and I'll pop my email address into the chat if you're interested in picking one up. You can also buy lamb directly, homegrown lamb from Hopland REC. You can buy it directly from us. So I'll pop that link into the chat in just a minute if you would like to be purchasing either of those things. Now, let's move across to some questions that we have. And for those of you who need to leave at 12, we do understand, and thank you so much for joining the webinar today. All right, John, I'm seeing that there are a few coming up in the chat now. So what's your take over native versus non-native? I know it's a big debate. And then what's your take on buying from nurseries, whether local or out of state, and the possibility of disease transmission? Want to start with those two?
Sure. Yeah, native versus non-native is a huge debate. I mean, I've been engaged in that around the design of this this project because some species of non-natives are wonderful beneficial insect habitats. You know, they provide good nectary resources. I guess my take is biased towards the native. They're adapted towards our area. They're part of the ecosystem that has evolved here. And so whether you're looking at pollinator insects or birds or mammals, they evolved with those type of plants that grow in our area. And natives can be is itself kind of a fraught term because, you know, some people are like, well, you know, you shouldn't take a blue oak from Sonoma County and put it up in Mendocino County because it's not really native and adapted to the area. Or some people say, well, it's native to California, it's down on the Channel Islands, but it's native to California, so I'm going to plant it. So we kind of took a mixed approach in this design where I stuck with California natives. Because it's a demonstration project, I put in a few natives not from our area that are specifically chosen for either a crop or a certain timing of bloom during the year. I think I would mostly recommend natives, but I think it's also a personal preference on what you're designing and what you're doing with your land. Be very careful that you don't choose invasive species. There's too many past problems with people saying, oh, I'm going to introduce this wonderful Bermuda grass because it's drought tolerant and I can walk on it all the time. And then it spreads all over the landscape. So really consult people who have a knowledge of our local ecosystem when choosing your plants. I'll point out again, Jim Zaroyan's up at Mendocino College, Cal Flora Nursery down in Sonoma County. But there's a lot of great resources. And I think by going to people like the local Natural Resource Conservation Service or the RCD, they can help you make some of those decisions. And then nurseries, I mean, I would, you know, for a host of reasons, buy from as local a nursery as you can because you're supporting local businesses, you're keeping your money local. They're more likely, not always, but more likely to be choosing plant sources that are nearby rather than shipping from Southern California. So, and then what's the last part is, have you seen or tried yourself overplanting? You know, I think that's something that we'll be looking at. That it's a matter too of balancing out the economics of it, because if you're overplanting, you're spending more money than you might need to on plants. But then you could also be balancing that out by not losing a year or two because other plants die out and then you already have something filling in versus a gap in your hedgerow. And I definitely am seeing, you know, the gophers are a big effect. So a little bit of overplanting or protecting with a root cage around the bottom could be something where you're guarding against those gaps in your hedgerow. Oh, and I see here Brooke posted in the chat that the Sanhedrin chapter of the California Native Plant Society also has lists, and she posted a link in there.
Excellent. And I noticed in the chat, a couple of folks have mentioned the Mendocino College